What do ugly holiday sweaters have to do with repelling foreign invaders?
It's all about Hanukkah and a curious coincidence of calendars. I'm Joel Millen.
And I'm Jamie Bennett.
And this is Bad Books of the Bible.
It's a podcast about a collection of books with a curious pedigree and an even stranger legacy. So I remember growing up, I didn't have a lot of Jewish friends in my part of California. But then I remember in 5th grade, we had this special thing in December where we had a guest come into our class.
Yeah.
And everybody in the class got a dreidel. And it was explained to us what the dreidel was all about, how to use it. I didn't exactly remember, but it made a big impression on me. And so for years, I had this dreidel that I got in 5th grade.
A spinning top with a message.
It's interesting because it is something that we hear about in this culture from time to time, but I don't think most Americans really know much about Hanukkah and dreidels and all of that stuff.
I sure didn't.
But as an adult, I moved to South Florida.
Mm-hmm.
There's a much heavier Jewish population here. And when I look around in December, I mean, you're just as likely to see blue and white Hanukkah lights on a house as you are Christmas lights.
No, seriously?
Seriously. Of course, my other favorite Hanukkah connection was from Saturday Night Live back in like the Adam Sandler era.
Yes, I think I know where this is going.
Yeah, and he would go on to the Weekend Update or whatever, and he'd share a song. And of course, one of my favorites was his Hanukkah song.
Put on your yarmulke, here comes Hanukkah. So much Hanukkah to celebrate Hanukkah.
One of my exposures goes back to a song also, Tom Lair's song, Hanukkah in Santa Monica.
Oh, my.
There is a line there that makes the connection, actually, to today's show. Here's to Judas Maccabeus. Boy, if he could only see us spending Hanukkah in Santa Monica by the sea.
Oh.
Yeah, it happened. It really happened.
That song has some gems in it, too. There are so many good lines.
It's like a lot of Tom Lair. It's just hilarious from the beginning to the end.
Right.
Yeah, he's a riot. But, you know, a lot of people do think of Hanukkah as a Jewish Christmas, but it does, in fact, go back to 1 Maccabees chapter 4, the rededication of the temple. And we'll be covering that in today's show. I mean, like, then what is the connection to Christmas? Because these are not, like, related holidays at all.
Well, there really isn't any. I mean, there kind of is, but it's a bit of a stretch. I mean, here's the thing. Hanukkah isn't even the most important Jewish holiday.
Yeah.
Right? Like we're talking Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. These are the holidays that have traditionally been the most important for the Jews.
Right.
Now, Christmas, though, is a major holiday for pretty much any country that has a lot of Christians.
Right. That would be us.
And if you're a country that has had a predominantly Christian influence, a lot of people in other faiths can feel alienated, kind of on the margins of the culture.
Right.
And Jews have felt on the margins of culture for many centuries or millennia, really.
Sure. Yeah.
So there's almost a certain kind of if you can't beat them, join them thing going on here.
So basically, Hanukkah falls near Christmas on the calendar.
Sure.
And because it's so important in Christian culture, Hanukkah, therefore, kind of picks up the draft of that, gets carried along in that, and gets more cultural importance, and has even adopted some Christmas features. Yeah. Like you mentioned, those blue lights on houses,
right?
Or gift giving. Like gift giving is not traditionally part of Hanukkah, but it's in America for certain. It certainly is. And then, of course, everybody's favorite, ugly holiday sweaters, like ugly Christmas sweaters. But no, they're not Christmas sweaters. We're talking ugly Hanukkah sweaters.
I think I've seen these a few places.
Right, like Oi to the World. I mean, can you beat that? That's great. Come on, baby, light my menorah. We all love that one. That's how I roll with a dreidel.
Yeah, and I even saw one that said, I like Hanukkah a lot key. I mean, this stuff is crazy.
So for many Jews in North America today, Hanukkah is a way to reinforce Jewish identity in a culture that's kind of like otherwise occupied. Right?
Yeah.
And speaking of occupations, in our last episode, which covered chapter 2 of the book, Mattathias starts a revolt against the Seleucids and passes control of the army to his son, Judas Maccabeus, before dying. We'll be covering 2 chapters today, chapters 3 and 4. And chapter 3 starts with Judas's rise to power.
Well, in chapter 1, it referred to those Jews who, it said, gladly went along with the Greek customs. They had abandoned the covenant, the traditional observances. And it was here that the faithful began to rally behind Judas and gladly fight for Israel.
Right. They repeat that word. It's sort of like they're putting a comparison in place here. Yeah. So the narrator then introduces Judas with a poem that connects him to Judah, like way back in Genesis. So that comparison thing that happens with the bad guys, it happens with the good guys too. And one of the things that the narrator is trying to do is link Judas Maccabeus, the whole Maccabean thing, the whole Hasmonean thing, back to all of these great heroes in Jewish tradition and Jewish history.
Yeah.
And one of those is Judah. So the line that is here is, he was like a lion in his deeds, like a lion's cub roaring for prey, which is like taken right out of Genesis 49.
Yeah.
There's also a line that keeps up the comparison with Phinehas that we mentioned last time. It says that he turned away wrath from Israel, which, again, that's a direct callback to the story of Phinehas, which you can find in Numbers 25. But that language, he turned wrath away from Israel, that's like right out of the book of Numbers.
Yeah, and there's also an implicit comparison with Alexander the Great. So, in chapter 1, we saw Alexander, right? He was introduced, this Macedonian king.
Yeah.
We saw him conquer the far ends of the earth. He was subjugating people everywhere he went.
Yeah.
Judah is here said to have been, quote, renowned to the ends of the earth. But he did it differently. Instead of subjugating the people, the narrator says that, quote, he gathered in those who were perishing.
Wow. I mean, that's
quite the contrast.
Yeah, that's amazing. All right, so Judas is in charge. And what should happen? But he's going to have to face some bad guys. And what this next part of the book that we're looking at here, these 2 chapters, they really show Judas in a series of battles between himself and what the Erdman's Bible commentary refers to as increasingly important Syrian generals. So you can kind of like imagine, if you want to do a video game in which the bad guys at the end of each level get worse and worse and worse. That's what's happening. That's what's happening in these 2 chapters.
So the first guy he tackles is Apollonius. Look at that. I said the name.
What? Don't wait a minute. Credit for that?
We got to mark this occasion.
Mark it. Bring out the champagne, people. We actually pronounced a name right.
So he not only seizes the spoils from Apollonius's army, but even takes the man's sword.
Ooh.
And he's going to use this sword for the rest of his life.
That is very David and Goliath.
Right. That's exactly how it feels.
So that's an example of how the author is like all along trying to keep kind of bring us back to these connections, like he's going to be reminding us all the time, like all these callbacks.
Yeah.
And it's not just like he's going to face one foe that's really bad. These foes, like we said, get bigger and bigger and bigger. So this David and Goliath motif continues really through all these battles.
Yeah.
So here you go. Here's the next one. He next tackles a commander named Saron. Saron's army was full of Syrians and apostate Jews. They gathered at the mountain pass of Beth Horon, which was, according to Josephus, like a famous ambush location. That's like where you went if you wanted to just like spring it on somebody.
That should be easy, right?
Right. Well, you would think. I mean, Saron is like, I'm going to make a name for myself. I'm going to win honor for the kingdom. I'm going to make war on Judas and his companions who scorn the king's command. He just thinks he's got it in the bag. This little ragtag army is going to come hiking up the mountain and he's going to slaughter them. But no, not so easy. Judah's army was heavily outnumbered. But remember, this is David and Goliath.
And so Judas tells his men in a speech that echoes one of David's speeches. He says, they come against us in great insolence and lawlessness to destroy us and our wives and our children and to despoil us. But we fight for our lives and our laws. He himself will crush them before us. As for you, do not be afraid of them. If you were to compare this to 1 Samuel 17, you will see similar language, but this idea that God is going to go out before us, that God is going to cause us to prevail.
Yeah.
And sure enough, they charged the enemy and they chased him down the mountainside, and they killed like 800 before the rest got away.
If the sword didn't get you, if the speech didn't get you, if the defeat of the greater foe weren't enough for the comparison, the narrator just grabs a paraphrase right out of First Chronicles about David. So it says here, so David's fame spread throughout every land, and the Lord made all the nations fear him. And now here's First Maccabees. Then Judas and his brothers began to be feared, and terror fell on the Gentiles all around them. This is like a very direct connection the author's trying to make here. And of course, when he says that terror fell on the Gentiles all around them and that the brothers were beginning to be feared, he didn't just mean, local boys.
Right.
The word is getting back to Antiochus that something mighty wrong is going on in Israel. And he is, as my old boss would say, hacked off when he gets the news.
Antiochus wasn't happy about this, and he really wants this rebellion shut down. The text actually says that he paid his soldiers a year in advance, and he told them to be ready for anything.
Yeah.
The thing that is kind of amusing here is that really what's behind the scenes, he's out of money.
What? I mean, this guy's the conqueror of the known world in his spot, right? In his time. He's picked up where Alexander left off, and he's like taken over as far as he can go, and he's short on cash.
Yeah, and you don't want people to know that.
No.
So the narrator says that his policy that was totally like enforced cultural assimilation, just a brutal enforcement, it was so disruptive. It basically dried up all the taxes.
You can get what you want if you have that much power, right up until you break the thing that you were trying to get, the result from.
Yeah, exactly.
We talked before about how Antiochus would raise funds by like robbing temples.
Yeah.
That's where valuables were. That's where he would go to like steal money for his own kingdom.
Sure.
Unfortunately, all the temples are out in the area. So he has to pack it up and head to Persia to raise funds. Now, these are also his lands, far, far east.
Mm-hmm.
And there's probably, some other unrest in the empire that he's also dealing with there. But
sure,
the text isn't interested in that. It's mostly just trying to say he's out of money and he's off the scene.
Yeah.
And that matters because he has to leave Syria and all the stuff happening in Israel to a delegate.
Right.
He hands it off to a guy named Lysias.
So he gives him half his army. He gives him a bunch of elephants that'll come in handy.
Who doesn't love elephants?
Right. And he tells him to take care of this rebellion in Judea. Just put an end to it.
Right. He just thinks it's going to be easy. Right.
Yeah.
He's like, just get rid of these annoying people.
Yeah. The narrator says he was to banish the memory of them from the place.
Wow.
Like basically he was supposed to run them out, give away all their goods, give everything away so that they're completely displaced.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. And again, this is Lysias's job, which is delegated to him by Antiochus.
Yeah.
But what does Lysias do? He delegates it. So he pushes it down to three guys: Ptolemy, not the one in Egypt, Nicanor, and oh no, Gorgias.
Let's go with Gorgias.
Along with 40,000 infantry and about 7,000 cavalry.
Wow.
Now, Nicanor, it's worth taking note of his name here. He doesn't really pop up again in these battles, but he does come again later. And he's called, in fact, in Second Maccabees, he's called the thrice cursed. So this is a big bad dude.
Yeah.
Nobody likes Nicanor. These guys, though, these generals, they arrive and they encamp on the plain by the town of Emmaus.
More forces kept pouring in. There were people coming from all over, extras from Syria, and even these nearby Philistines were joining in.
Like like Philistines, like right out of David and Goliath Philistines.
That's right. These are foreigners.
Yeah.
These guys have been causing problems in the region for a long time, like well over 1,000 years by this point.
Yeah.
You know, they're one of the sea peoples who contributed to the collapse during the Bronze Age. Now,
there's nothing good that comes from Philistines. Can we just say that?
Nothing good. Nothing good.
Nothing good.
Now, later, the Romans would end up naming the region Palestine after the Philistines.
Except the name. Maybe the name is good.
The name stuck, apparently. Now, they're probably most famous in scripture from Saul and David's encounters. And so once again, like we pointed out earlier, it's another echo of the David story.
Yeah. Okay, so we got 40,000 infantry, 7,000 cavalry. What?
Yeah.
And extras pouring in left and right. What are Judas and the rest of his dowdy resistors going to do? Probably what, out of desperation, all of us might do. He rallied his people and they prayed for mercy. The narrator says, so the congregation assembled to be ready for battle, and they prayed and asked for mercy and compassion. They rent their clothes, they covered their heads with ashes, and interesting, they read from the law.
Well, Joel, one thing this does remind me of,
Yeah.
in the ancient treaties, they would often read a portion of the treaty beforehand. And many scholars have taken from that, and they've seen, like, when the Israelites are at the foot of Sinai, that, the covenant is read to them. And it's a reminder of their duties to God and what God has promised to them.
Totally.
So to me, this jumps out as like kind of fulfilling the same purpose, recentering them on the covenant that they have with God.
Yep.
And reminding them of their purpose for going out.
It also explains what you just described, that dynamic, that relationship describes why they are so determined to fight the Seleucids.
Yeah.
Because those treaties, like you're describing, the suzerainty treaties.
Yeah, exactly.
Those treaties are there like over to subjected people, and it gives the terms of like the peace, right? And they already have a deal with Yahweh. They already have a deal with God. And here comes Antiochus, who's saying, no, I'm going to wipe out your deal. I got a new deal. And they're like, we don't want your deal.
Yeah.
And so by them reading the law before this battle, they are like renewing the covenant in a sense.
Yeah. After praying, they geared up, and Judas's army moved south of Emmaus to meet the enemy. And Judas said to them, arm yourselves and be courageous. Be ready early in the morning to fight with these Gentiles who've assembled against us to destroy us and our sanctuary. It is better for us to die in battle than to see the misfortunes of our nation and of the sanctuary. But as his will in heaven may be, so shall he do.
I want to set up a parallel here. It's there in the text, but there's not like time markers to make this obvious. Judas is in the middle of praying. His men are reading the scripture, or the scriptures being read to them. They are preparing for battle. They are dedicating themselves to the Lord, to his covenant, before they go out to fight. Meanwhile, Gorgias, that sneaky snake, is conspiring with his men to ambush them. And this is clearly happening at the same time, because what's happening here is that they decide to do a sneak attack on Judas and his men while they're encamped.
Yeah.
So they're encamped at a place called Mizpah, and somebody had like finked them out as being there. And so Gorgias decides that he will basically ambush him, that he'll like spring a trap on him and get him, and it'll be a cinch, like it'll be over, it'll be easy. However, that's not what happened. Judas's men get up and leave after their prayer to go attack at Emmaus, right?
Yikes.
So they leave Mizpah. Gorgias, meanwhile, he comes down to Mizpah and he sees that the Jews have pulled up stakes and they've left. So he thinks that they're in retreat. Little does he know that they're actually en route to Emmaus to wipe out his camp. Oops.
So Judas and his men have pulled out and they're ready to fight at Emmaus, but it won't be easy. They only have about 3,000 men, and it says that they're outnumbered something like 13-1.
Yikes.
You know, Judas's ragtag group of guys doesn't have the same training, equipment, full arming of the Seleucid forces. Yet nevertheless, he reminds them of the covenant. He rallies them together. He cries out to God, and they go forward. And amazingly, they win. It says the Gentiles were crushed and fled into the plain, and all those in the rear fell by the sword.
Now, what about Gorgias and his guys? They are coming back now from their misadventure, not finding the army.
Yeah.
As they're coming back, sorry, it's too late. The attack's already happened. And even though you might have been able to make a difference, it's too late. And in fact, there's smoke rising from their own camp, so they retreat. Yeah. It's like confusion on top of confusion for Gorgias or for Gorgias and his men. And so Israel is delivered. But there's another battle brewing.
But Lysias can't sit by and let this go. So he's going to send another army, and this time an even bigger one.
Oops.
So about a year later, after Judas won the victory at Emmaus, Lysias sent in another attack, and he wanted to attack Judea and specifically Jerusalem, but this time they came from a different angle.
Yeah.
They came from the southeast. Now, just like before, it doesn't look good. And so Judas prays that God would fill their enemies with what? Cowardice. And that's basically what happens.
Lysias loses 5,000 men and suddenly decides he probably can't win. So he retreats for Syria. I mean, this is crazy. He's got 60,000 infantry. He's got 5,000 cavalry.
Yeah.
And Judah's army, this little group of guys, is so intense, so determined, and apparently so swift in killing 5,000 that Lysias just completely loses heart and decides to go home. He calls off the dogs.
Second Maccabees tells us that after the defeat, Lysias thought that the Jews must be invincible, that God's blessing was too strong, and that he couldn't compete. And so he decided to end his campaign and revise the Seleucid policies towards the Jews. And he basically issues a letter of amnesty.
So he's like, we can't win. We might as well, sue for peace. And we're gonna this cultural assimilation thing that we've been trying, we're gonna rethink it.
And that's where the ugly holiday sweaters come in.
We're back to Hanukkah.
Yes, we are. So remember that scene in Lord of the Rings when they come back and they cleanse the Shire?
Yeah.
Well, at this point in the text, Judas and his brothers say to one another, look, we've driven our enemies out. They're crushed. Let's go cleanse the sanctuary and let's dedicate it again to God.
And it needs to be clean, right? The last tenants, they didn't treat it very well. So these guys are definitely losing their deposit. When Antiochus set up shop in the temple, I mean, they sacrificed pigs. They put up a statue to Zeus. I mean, they did a bunch of naughty in the temple.
Yeah, and this was foretold before by the prophets. Micah, for example, had talked about the Temple Mount becoming just like a scrap pile of wood. Isaiah talked about it, just the land being desolate and destroyed.
And desolate, that's a key word, right? Because the abomination that causes desolation, this is the desolation. Now we've seen it. Now we're living it.
Yeah.
They've kicked out the squatters and the temple's a mess. What are they going to do?
Yeah.
The first thing they do is they get blameless priests,
Sure.
which is a line from Leviticus again, these guys are like consulting the law as they're on this process of rededicating the temple.
Yeah.
They're very attuned to what the Lord has said they need to be thinking of as they're in the act of rededicating the temple.
Yeah.
The stones that had been used in the temple have to be pulled out. Like the altar stone is now ruined.
Yeah.
So
They're like desecrated totally.
they're totally desecrated. They don't really know what to do with them. They're going to wait till a prophet comes to tell them what to do with them, because, you know, there's no provision in the Torah for what to do with desecrated altar stones, I guess.
Right.
So it's not in there. That's an eventuality that was not covered. And so they don't know what to do, but they know they sure as heck can't have it in the temple.
Yeah.
So they drag those stones out and they literally throw them to hell, which is to say they toss them down into the Gehenna Valley.
Right.
And then they build a new altar. And again, they're following what they find in the Torah on this. So they're following what you find in Exodus 20. And then they rededicate the temple. And they use essentially what they pick up from 1 Kings chapter 8, as well as what you get out of the temple dedication from the time of Ezra.
Judas and his brothers, after they've restored the altar and everything, they've then said, hey, this is something that needs to be remembered.
This is not as big as Rosh Hashanah, for instance, or Yom Kippur, but this is a big day.
Every year with joy and gladness. And specifically, they had an 8-day memorial. Now, why would they do that, Joel?
As I understand it, they had enough oil to light the temple for one night.
They were almost out.
Just one night. They were out, or nearly out. They lit the lamp, and they had miraculously more than enough. Not just for the first night, but the second night, and the third night, and a fourth night, all the way up to 8 nights. And that's where the lighting of the menorah comes from, and specifically that 8th candle.
So many of our Jewish friends continue to celebrate this today.
Yeah.
And we see them lighting the menorah, celebrating Hanukkah.
Yeah.
It symbolizes the light of the law, of God's covenant with them.
The illumination that comes from the law.
And it was also on this feast that John chapter 10 tells us that Jesus told the Jews that he was the Son of God.
So, yeah, I mean, a lot of people are maybe even surprised to know, but Jesus celebrated Hanukkah.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe not exactly the, ugly Hanukkah sweater version that we observe today, or people observe today. But it says, for instance, in John chapter 10, verse 22, it was the feast of dedication at Jerusalem. It was the winter, and Jesus was walking in the temple in the portico of Solomon.
Wow.
Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is where he announces to them that he is the Son of God.
That's amazing.
And so, kids, that was the first Hanukkah. But we're not at the end of our story, because the enemy is not yet fully gone. The citadel that was in sight of the temple, that's still in enemy hands. Meanwhile, Judas, he decides the best thing that they can do is fortify the temple. And so he gets his men together and they refortify the walls of the Temple Mount to prevent the desecration from ever happening again.
But wait, Joel, we can't forget about the dreidel.
The dreidel?
The dreidel isn't just a silly game. It actually teaches something.
What does it teach, Jamie?
There are Hebrew letters on each side of the dreidel, and they form an acrostic.
Okay.
The acrostic can basically be translated to a great miracle happened here.
Oh, wow.
And so in the life of the Jewish people, when they're celebrating Hanukkah and they're lighting the menorah and they're playing with the dreidel, they have opportunity to recount to their children the most important parts of the story, of the history, and of God's faithfulness to the Jewish people in the time of the Maccabees. And that is the true story of the dreidel.
And on that note, it's time for a shameless plug. If you love this show as much as we love this show, you'll want to share this show. So one thing we're asking is to make sure you tell a friend or an enemy or somebody about Bad Books of the Bible. Do it today. In fact, do it right now. And as long as you're at it, why don't you also go to badbooksofthebible.com. That's where you can sign up for the email list. You can get the show notes. And as long as you're at that, you might as well do the next best thing, which is to go rate and review. We love 5-star reviews. They're about our favorite thing, next to the next chapter of Maccabees, which we like even more. And you're going to like it too. So you'll want to come back after you give us a great review on iTunes.
I'm Jamie Bennett.
And I'm Joel Miller.
And you've been listening to Bad Books of the Bible,
a production of Ancient Faith Radio. Come back next week and somebody big is going to bite the dust.